Welcome to video 4 for the project to amend the city zoning ordinance. This presentation will cover changes to commercial zones. Before continuing, we encourage you to watch the 3.5-minute introductory video. Also, if at the end of this video you have further questions or are wondering about terms used that you might not be familiar with, we encourage you to contact a Planning Division staff member. Also, please keep in mind that in an effort to keep these presentations under 15 minutes long, you may find that we haven't covered something in as much depth as you would like. We encourage you to pause the presentation on slides that interest you and review the information on the screen, as it will typically be more in depth than what we cover in the audio portion. In this video, we'll cover zone conversion in a little more depth than in the previous videos. We'll also cover standards that will apply to all commercial zones, a summary of each individual zone, and changes to buffers between commercial and residential development, as well as parking standards. Zone conversion for commercial took a little different approach than residential. When you look at the left-hand side of the table, you'll notice that we had quite a palette of commercial zones. But when we looked through them, the main differences were really in the allowed uses. There were also zones that were rarely used because they had been written for specific purposes. To relate it to the comprehensive plan, we looked at how the zones really function. The plan talks about making commercial development really work. It also talks about making services conveniently available to neighborhoods and making walking and biking to stores and services as realistic a possibility as driving. The plan also talks about the need to serve the traveling public and have areas for larger commercial development. Finally, we again considered the types of comments we've heard over many years of public hearings. What were neighbors to commercial development typically worried about? How could we improve the transition between these types of development? All of these factors were considered with these changes. Our current proposal reduces the number of commercial zones from 7 to 4. The 4 zones represent an area for professional and medical offices with some limited retail options, a commercial zone designed to be close to neighborhoods, a zone for older areas of town, and a zone for automobile-oriented development. We're going to spend some time on these next 2 slides talking about standards that will apply to all commercial zones. One of the common concerns we've heard is about how close commercial buildings can be to residential properties. In the proposed ordinance, any building that is more than 24 feet tall has to increase the setback from residential to 30 feet. Also, as the height of the building increases beyond 24 feet, so does the setback. The next standard that will apply to all commercial zones has to do with how buildings interact with the street. In the proposed code, buildings cannot have any blank walls facing a public street. Walls facing a street must be treated with one of the 4 options shown on the bottom of the graphic. There can be a vertical trellis in front of the wall with some type of plant material, windows covering at least 20% of the wall, a landscaped planting bed, or artwork that covers at least 50% of the wall. Of course, that wall can also be used as an entrance to the building. The idea here is to prevent buildings from turning their back on the street, but rather keep streetscapes inviting and open to the public. The professional business or PB zone standards are basically the same in terms of setbacks, building heights, and landscaping. The main difference is in the allowed uses. We combined PB with the medical services zone, which allowed things like small restaurants and retail shops, with the idea being that in medical centers, people who are there a little bit longer term and visiting family need access to those services. We also tried to consider what folks who work in office and medical centers might need quick and convenient access to. Some of the uses you see listed would be limited in size. For example, a limited eating establishment would have a maximum footprint of 3,000 square feet. Craftsman industry, which includes things like studios, jewelry making, and furniture refinishing, would be limited to 1,500 square feet. Other uses like a food store or a Walgreens don't currently have a size limit in the proposed code. While this does open the door for more commercial uses in the PB zone, we have tried to write the zone so that professional and medical offices are still the predominant land uses. For real commercial development, this is not the most accommodating zone. The next 2 slides deal with the limited commercial or LC zone. LC is meant to be more of a pedestrian-friendly zone because it will typically be located close to neighborhoods. That does not mean that large-scale commercial development can't be built here. It just means that the site development standards are a little different than the highway commercial zone, which is meant to be located near highways and other major roadways. One of the changes, as shown on this slide, is the increase to the landscaping required along a street. The C1 zone, which the LC zone replaces, currently requires a 15-foot wide landscape area adjacent to public streets. We are proposing to increase this to 20 feet. However, in the LC zone, we are also proposing an option to reduce this landscape area. We'll cover this in the next slide. If the LC zone is going to be more accommodating of pedestrians and cyclists, we needed to think of ways to encourage better pedestrian-oriented design. We recognize that in today's world, a business is not likely to survive on foot traffic alone, so please don't think that we've tried to make it more difficult to design for cars. Instead, we've tried to think of ways to incentivize designing for pedestrians. What we are proposing as a start is an incentive to reduce the required landscaping along a street in exchange for that pedestrian-oriented design. In the LC zone, a builder can reduce the 20-foot wide landscaping area along a street to 10 feet if the building is placed 10 feet from the street and a pedestrian pathway is built to connect the sidewalk to the entrance of the building. We think this is a fairly simple way to encourage buildings to be closer to the roadway and the sidewalk, which is a much more pedestrian-friendly design, instead of separating itself by 1 or 2 rows of parking. This also creates a better streetscape overall by emphasizing the building instead of the parking. The requirement for the pathway creates a more welcoming invitation for the walker or cyclist to enter the building. The Central Commercial, or CC Zone, has traditionally been reserved for downtown. It was written for areas built before zoning existed, generally with no setbacks, limited parking, and a mix of uses. However, we felt now was the right time to expand the use of the CC Zone. We recently completed a new form-based zoning ordinance for the downtown. The CC Zone really isn't needed in that area anymore. As we studied the development patterns of the city, we found that there are other areas built with 0 setbacks, limited parking, and a mix of uses. Some of these areas are shown on this slide. They include First Street, Northgate Mile, parts of Holmes Avenue, and the Warehouse District along Capitol and Pancary, among others. The CC Zone seems a much more appropriate fit for these areas than zones written for developments that have occurred since the automobile became more common. The standards are the same as the CC1 zone today, and most of the allowed uses also remain the same. I would point out that we think that long-term, a form-based code is a better fit for these areas. However, because form-based codes take a lot of time, thought, and study of the area, the CC zone is proposed as more of a short-term solution with this project. The Highway Commercial, or HC Zone, is designed for more auto-oriented, large-scale commercial development. There aren't many changes proposed for this zone, as it has been fairly successful. One of the changes is to reduce the front setback from 30 feet to 20 feet. The reason for this is the landscape strip along the streets is 20 feet wide. Requiring a 30-foot setback creates an awkward, mostly unusable 10 feet of space between the landscaping and the building. What this ends up doing is pushing more parking in between the landscaping and the building. The other change is in the buffering from residential. The buffer is required to be 30 feet as it is today. However, if an 8-foot tall masonry wall is constructed, the buffer may be reduced to 10 feet in width. One of the reasons commercial rezones have failed in the past is that neighboring residential property owners don't think the buffering requirements are sufficient to protect them against nuisances from the commercial development. We have proposed the buffering requirements be increased. Today in the C1 zone, a developer can choose between a 10-foot wide landscape buffer or a 6-foot fence. Those are very different options. We are proposing for the LC zone to have a 20-foot landscape buffer. In the HC, as we've already mentioned, the buffer is 30 feet. In both cases, however, if an 8-foot tall masonry wall is constructed, the buffer may be reduced to 10 feet. This does not affect the requirement for buildings taller than 24 feet to be set back further from adjacent residential properties. It is really about requiring a more effective buffer between commercial and residential development. Parking requirements was one of the more challenging aspects of this project. In studying a lot of information, we found our parking requirements are generally too high. However, we also realized that it is difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach to parking. There are three main changes to the parking standards. First, in general, we have reduced the number of stalls required. For example, restaurants will only be required to provide 10 stalls per 1,000 square feet of building instead of 15 stalls. Second, we have created a process for requests to reduce parking. If an applicant can provide sufficient data to show less parking is needed than what we require, the zoning administrator may reduce the parking requirement. This is in recognition that not all uses function the same way. Sticking with the restaurant example, a fast food restaurant that relies primarily on drive-through orders has different parking needs than a casual sit-down restaurant, yet the parking standards are the same. This change will allow requests to be made to right-size the parking for the development. The third change will be covered in the next slide. The third change to the parking requirements is the introduction of parking credits. Currently, there are no options for parking credits in the code. A parking credit is a method to reduce the number of parking stalls required in exchange for some other parking feature. In the proposed ordinance, we have introduced credits for providing bicycle parking, allowing on-street parking to be counted when available, and being within a certain distance from a public transit stop. We recognize that Idaho Falls is still finding its way in terms of public transportation, but there's no reason not to plan for it now. One other new feature to the code is standards for compact parking. Currently, our code doesn't allow compact parking to be counted towards the required number of stalls. This code will allow this, but at a maximum percentage of the required parking. Thank you again for viewing this presentation. We hope you found it informative and helpful. This is one of the more complicated sections of this project. Again, please feel free to contact our staff if you have further questions. We'd be happy to answer your questions and hear your thoughts on this important issue. Please also consider taking a look at our other video presentations on the rest of the zoning ordinance.